Most of my videos on this channel have emphasized the importance of 3D forms in drawing, but there is a benefit of thinking in two-dimensional shapes. While forms are incredibly useful and they allow us to create subjects in any angle, they fall short when it comes to creating aesthetically pleasing images. And this is evidenced by sketches that might have perfect perspective, but are still lacking something. And by sketches that might have issues with perspective, but are still vibrant and beautiful to look at. In this situation I'm drawing right now, we're seeing objects in 3 dimensions. We see all sides of them. But the image that the camera is producing is a 2-dimensional representation of this. A combination of the positive and negative shapes, as well as the shapes of light and shadow, come together to create a 2-dimensional image that appears 3-dimensional. Most classical artists observe the world in this manner, and it can yield amazing results when drawing from life or painting large landscapes. But in my opinion, this approach falls a bit short when doing anything very perspective heavy or from imagination. But I bring it up because I think a combination of these two approaches allows you to get the best of both worlds. Forms allow us to place complex subjects in perspective, while shapes allow us to create interesting and vibrant designs with our mark making. So let's take a look at this in action. This week for the demo portion, I'm going to be sketching a character, so I'll show you how I simplify some of the anatomical forms into shapes. So I'm beginning by blocking out the forms of the eye and socket. If you go back to the structural anatomy series, you can see all of the forms I use for the structures of the face. In my illustrations, most of my line and shape choices are dependent on a combination of the 3D form and the lighting. So now I'm going to render these forms in 3 different ways and show you how we can simplify them into shapes. In this first example, the light is coming from above, so all the bottom-facing planes are in shadow. And now here, the light is coming from underneath, so all the top-facing planes are in shadow. And in our third example, the light will be coming from the right side. Now these are decent studies, but we're not going to go through the effort of creating and rendering each of these forms every time we want to draw a face. In addition to that, they don't demonstrate much style or illustrative decision making. So let's take a more macroscopic view of the face and see how these lighting scenarios would appear when the face is simplified into shapes. In this case, the only thing we're seeing is the shapes of shadow that the bottom planes create. What you can see is that even though these shapes are relatively simple, when combined they yield a complex and recognizable result. Now in this second example, all the top-facing planes will be in shadow, so I'm using shapes to represent all of those. Once again, we can see the power of using simple shapes to represent complex structures. And now our third example where the light is coming from the right side. Now let's see how we can combine this approach with some of the line drawing techniques we've discussed in the past. To review, one of the main techniques that we can use in line drawing is utilizing line weights. Heavier line weights are typically reserved for planes that are in shadow. C and S curves will be helpful to make our drawings look as though they have some movement, and beneficial in texturing. Tapered lines will also help with this, as their line weight gets thinner as they recede into the page. Blurring or smudging lines will help create soft edges and make forms appear more round. Wrapping lines will also help create a sense of roundness, as they follow an elliptical path as they wrap around a form. And we can use these techniques in combination to create an aesthetically pleasing result. When rendering this cylinder, I smudge some of these wrapping lines to help create a soft edge. Because I don't want my edges to appear too soft, I come back in and draw an additional set of wrapping lines. So now let's combine everything we've discussed so far. our simplification of form into shape, and the aforementioned line drawing techniques. Now feel free to do this in any style of your choosing. Here I'm just using the fewest amount of lines possible. As I've mentioned, top lighting is the most common lighting scenario, so I'm using the heaviest lines on the bottom facing planes. I'm also merging the shapes of shadows wherever I can. If, for example, the shadow from the bridge of the nose overlaps with that of the eye, I just merge them into one solid shape. Experiment with creating new shapes and exaggerations. Since it's much easier to modify the shadow shape created by the eyelid than it is to modify the three-dimensional form, we can come up with a lot more variations in design choices since we're not bogged down by perspective. We can use the three-dimensional forms to dictate where we place these shapes, but thinking about it in a somewhat two-dimensional manner has allowed us to come up with a greater variety of them. People often wonder where drawing style comes from. For many, it happens naturally, but I believe that it can be studied like any other principle of art. If we boil it down to its essential principles, I find that style is comprised of 5 things. The type of marks an artist makes, be it lines or blocks of value, the shape choices and simplifications, the subject matter and story of the pieces, the choices of camera lens, even if it's not a conscious decision, and the mediums that an artist uses. So let's discuss each of these a little bit further. Mark making we've already taken a pretty thorough look at, and I've explained why I use wrapping lines, smudging, and hatching. And if your goal was to add more rendering information to the simplifications that I'm drawing on screen right now, then I would suggest using hatching and wrapping lines to add in a wider range of values into these sketches. That being said, having clear decisions about mark making is integral to style. Examine the works of Kim Jung-gi versus Ian McCaig. The first tends to use minimal detail on his characters' faces, just sketching in the silhouettes of the major forms and some hatching lines, whereas the faces of Ian McCaig's characters tend to have more texture and value to them. The shape choices that an artist uses are a big part of style. For example, does an artist make all of their ears very pointy and triangular? Do they make them very wide and flat? These things may fluctuate from sketch to sketch, but their overall tendencies will yield a style. Along with this comes simplification of subjects. You'll notice that artists that try to recreate every single shape, value, and form in life often have unremarkable results. The reason being is that their art shows little to no decision making. It's the job of the artist and not the observer to decide what's important. Camera positioning and choice of lens is something that many artists overlook when discussing style. Obviously, if you're comfortable with perspective, you should be able to reposition the camera to where you please, but you'll definitely have some preferences as to what types of shots you'll like to get. As far as lenses go, many artists choose to do their work in a longer, more orthographic lens. This allows them to focus on shape rather than forms, whereas others like Kim Jung-gi and Evan Amundsen tend to do their work in a wide-angle lens, which can create a very dynamic picture. The next 2 things I included were subject matter and mediums. An artist's style can still show through even when these 2 factors are changed, but I think it'd be wrong to say that they're not contributing factors to an artist's overall style. Every artist has some medium that they're most comfortable with, and some subjects that they like to draw more than others. Don't be afraid to go beyond your style and challenge yourself to develop new techniques, but also try to reinforce those things that you do find most important. Artists with the most memorable work play to their strengths, and emphasize the elements that make their work the most appealing. So now let's take everything we've talked about so far in this lesson and combine it into a character sketch. I'm using a primitive blockout in low opacity to figure out the perspective of my character, but I'm not allowing it to dictate my mark making. I'm using wrapping lines and smudge lines to help create value and texture. Smudging those lines helps emphasize the softness and roundness of the edge. Notice how with the elements like the eyes and the belts, I'm just simplifying them to their shadow shapes. Remember that there's no singular way to do art, and challenge yourself to look at the world in a different way when you can. With that being said, I'd like to thank you for checking out this video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and click that notification bell. I try to release a new video at least 3 to 4 times per month, and I live stream every Saturday and Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you want access to the archive of live streams, which is constantly being updated, consider supporting on Patreon. And if you'd like to learn from me in person, I'll be teaching 3 classes at the Brainstorm School in Burbank, California this summer. The link will be in the description box below.